All right, so we're going to pick up here and talk about the uterine tubes. And the uterine tubes are also called the fallopian tubes. They essentially extend laterally from both sides of the superior part of the uterus. And the secondary oocyte is usually fertilized in the lateral parts of the uterine tube, somewhere along that line. Then that fertilized egg is transported medially towards the uterus through the ciliary action of the epithelium that lines the inside of the uterine tube. It can take the pre-embryo like 3 days or so to travel the length of the uterine tube. They're small, and these cilia only work so fast, and before they reach the lumen of the uterus. Now, these tubes can be up to 10 to 12 centimeters in length because they spiral. That's why that length's hidden in there. And they're covered by a type of connective tissue called mesosalpinx, and it's part of the broad ligament. So what we find here, you guys, is that the uterus and the ovary are held in position by our broad ligament here. Then we have an ovarian ligament here that connects the ovary to the uterus itself. Associated with the ovary, we have our fimbriae, and that leads along the uterine tube over here towards the superior part of the uterus. Now, the uterine tubes have three walls or layers here. In the wall of the uterine tube, we have our mucosa, which is a ciliated columnar epithelium. The cilia actually help wave that secondary oocyte towards the uterus. We have a muscularis, which is deeper. It's actually a layer of smooth muscle that's involved with peristaltic waves of contraction. And then we have an outer layer of serosa, which is an actually external serous membrane covering along the uterine tube that helps prevent frictional damage to the uterine tube. Now, the uterus is this pear-shaped or piriform-shaped, thick-walled muscular organ within the pelvic cavity, and it's supported by our suspensory ligaments within our pelvic cavity. There's 4 main regions. We have our fundus, body, isthmus, and cervix. So looking at a picture here, we have our fundus, our body, our isthmus over here, and then our cervix, which is on the neck. Now, isthmus over here, which is near the fallopian tube. Now, so the fallopian tube connects over here by the fundus at our isthmus here. And our cervix has a couple key areas. The outer part of the cervix here, it's kind of a donut. They say it's donut-shaped structure. You can't really see it from this viewpoint, but you can see it's sort of, if you're looking at through the vaginal canal, it's kind of inner tube shaped. Now the center here, we have our external os, which then leads into our cervical canal, and then an internal os, which is deeper within the body of the uterus. Now, the cervical canal is typically plugged with mucus, and that mucus serves protective functions to prevent bacteria from, entering the uterus and pelvic cavity through the way of the vagina. Inside the body of the uterus, we find our endometrium, which lines the inside of the uterus itself. An endometrium has a nourishing type of epithelium and connective tissue. Deep to that, we have our myometrium, which is a thick layer of smooth muscle. And this smooth muscle is excited by hormone oxytocin, which actually stimulates uterine contractions. And there are also nerve endings that attach to this smooth muscle. And then the outside of our uterus here, we have the perimetrium, which is actually kind of a thicker type of connective tissue that's just involved with protection of the uterus itself. Now, in terms of functions of the uterus, it's a site of implantation. It supports and protects the developing embryo and fetus, as well as it helps to eject the fetus during labor. So the site of implantation is the endometrium, where the fertilized egg can actually implant within that epithelial tissue inside the uterus. And then it's supported by the underlying connective tissue, which has a lot of blood vessels that can actually help nourish that fertilized egg. And it's protected in the sense that the uterus is a fairly thickly walled structure, also found within the pelvic cavity, so surrounded by a bony structure there. But it also aids in labor because the uterus, as a thickly walled muscular organ, that smooth muscle in the uterus, the myometrium, can actually contract and force the fetus out during labor. Now, in terms of the wall of the uterus, we've got those 3 layers, remember? So we have our endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. The endometrium is a mucosa that's composed of a simple columnar epithelium with underlying lamina propria, which is a nourishing connective tissue, as well as uterine glands that enlarge with the uterine cycle. We'll talk about that. Deep to the endometrium, we have our myometrium, which is a thick, smooth muscle layer. And then more exterior to that, we have our perimetrium, which is the outermost layer composed of a fibrous tissue that's surrounded by some serous membrane. Now, if you look at a cross-section of the uterus here, and the only way you can see it in this view is looking at a very small uterus. So this would be like the uterus of of a mouse or something, right? Because this is a microscopic view of the uterus, and you couldn't see all 3 layers of the uterus if this was a human uterus, right? Microscopically, you couldn't get all 3 layers in the same view. So our endometrium is what lines the inside of the uterus here. Remember, it's a simple columnar epithelium with an underlying lamina propria. All of these here are uterine glands, which are effectively mucus glands, and these uterine glands have ducts that empty out into the lumen of the uterus here, and they actually produce a mucus that helps to fill in the space and helps to protect against things like infection. Now, this is all lamina propria, which is the underlying connective tissue. Remember, lamina propria is made of loose areolar connective tissue, so it's a very nourishing type of connective tissue for the rest of the endometrium. And then deep to that, we find our myometrium, which is the smooth muscle layer. Remember, smooth muscle is under involuntary control, so that uterine contractions are under the control of the involuntary or autonomic nervous system, as well as hormonal factors like oxytocin. Now, surrounding the very outside of the uterus, we have a perimetrium, which is a fibrous outer tissue that parts of it are surrounded by a serous membrane. Now, for the endometrium, there's 2 main layers within this. We have our functional layer and our basal layer. The basal layer is also called stratum basalis, and it's a deeper layer that's adjacent to the myometrium or smooth muscle of the uterus. It undergoes little changes during the uterine cycle. So the basal layer doesn't really change a lot with a normal uterine cycle. So we talk about how the endometrium grows and sheds over the course of a uterine cycle. The basal layer doesn't change a whole lot. And so what does change is actually called stratum functionalis, the functional layer, because this is the one that will grow and shed with normal uterine cycles. So this functional layer, stratum functionalis of the uterus, is what lines the lumen of the uterus. So it's the most sort of deep, right next to the space inside the uterus. And it changes in thickness during normal uterine cycle. It will shed during the menstrual phase as well, and then regrow later on. Now, for the uterine or menstrual cycle, we have 3 main phases. We have the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. And all of these phases are influenced by hormonal factors. So there are changes in hormone concentration that correlate with development of ovaries. Or not ovaries, yeah. They actually correlate with development of the ovarian follicle. And so when you get changes in the ovarian follicles, you actually see that there's changes in hormonal levels. And these hormone levels actually will influence our menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. So they're under the influence of things like estrogen and progesterone. Now, the menstrual phase is what we call day 0. So day 0 is the beginning of the whole uterine cycle. And you just got to pick a starting point. It's a circle. It's a cycle. Just like the cardiac cycle, you got to pick a starting point. Well, our starting point here is going to be the menstrual phase. Now, if y'all remember, corpus luteum is what secreted a lot of progesterone and estrogen from a previous ovulation. But if fertilization doesn't occur, what happened to that corpus luteum? It turned into corpus albicans, right? What is corpus albicans? Scar tissue. And if it's scar tissue, it's basically dead cells and fibers. And so those aren't releasing a lot of hormones at that point, right? So what happens then is that the menstrual phase begins when hormone levels fall dramatically. So progesterone and estrogen levels drop out because corpus luteum is now degrading into corpus albicans. That begins the menstrual phase, which is day 0, and that continues over the course of the next several days, like the next 5 days or so. Now, the proliferative phase begins after that, and the proliferative phase is really marked by a regrowth of the stratum functionalis. So that growth of the stratum functionalis is actually influenced by the estrogen that's being secreted by the newly developing follicles. So the primary and secondary follicles that are developing now, they're starting to release a little bit of estrogen. When that estrogen is actually now stimulating the regrowth of our stratum functionalis during the proliferative phase. Now the secretory phase begins after ovulation, which is day 14, mid-cycle. And so the secretory phase accompanies most of the uterine cycle, right? So if this is a whole 28-day cycle, basically the secretory phase accounts for 14 of that, right? 14 of those days is the secretory phase, which occurs after the ovulation of the egg. And so after ovulation, the follicular cells that were left behind in the ovary turn into corpus luteum. And that secretes a lot of progesterone and estrogen, which actually allows this endometrium to grow even thicker during the secretory phase. So during the secretory phase, we see proliferation of the endometrium even more so. We get growth of the uterine glands and a thickening of the underlying lamina propria, so you get more connective tissue. That's during the secretory phase. Bless you. So what we see here, you guys, is actually an overview of our uterine phases and our ovarian phases. So we can't talk about the uterine phases without also talking about, well, what's also happening in the ovary, right? Because if growth of and shedding of the uterine lining is under the influence of hormones released by the ovary, that means you have to talk about both co-occurring, right? So we talk about day 0 as being what for the uterus? Menstrual phase. You got it. So days 0 through 5, we have a menstrual phase. Okay. So the menstrual phase is our first phase of the uterine cycle, and then after menses, so shedding of the old endometrium has ended. Because the new follicles are developing, they're releasing more estrogen, right? So that later on, when you get enough estrogen, you start to get a regrowth of that endometrium during the proliferative phase. And this continues until day 14. Day 14 is mid-cycle, which is when ovulation occurs. So that secondary oocyte in the ovary is ovulated. And then after ovulation, what happens to the follicular cells that are left behind in the ovary? They turn to corpus luteum. You got it. So the corpus luteum then will start to secrete a tremendous amount of progesterone and estrogen, which then begins the secretory phase. So our secretory phase occurs when the corpus luteum is secreting a lot of progesterone and estrogen. It makes sense. So the corpus luteum then is secreting all these hormones from the ovary, right? And it's actually stimulating the growth of that endometrium even thicker. So we'll see a picture of what the secretory phase looks like, and it's actually where the endometrium becomes much thicker. You get a thickening of the connective tissue and a hypertrophy or growth of the uterine glands. Remember, those produce protective mucus. So that's the uterine phase. But that also matches up with what's happening in the ovary, right? Because the ovary is what's releasing hormones that influence the growing and shedding of the endometrium of the uterus. So what's going on during the ovary this time? Well, during the menstrual phase, what happens is that in the ovary, we have new follicles developing. Okay, so some primordial follicles are now being allowed to develop into primary follicles. That's why we call it the follicular phase. And as these primary follicles are developing into secondary follicles and tertiary follicles, this still is during the follicular phase. Then right at day 14, the tertiary follicle gets ovulated. Now we'll talk about what the stimulus for that is in a little bit. But ovulation occurs right at mid-cycle. And so after ovulation, what happens then is that we get the corpus luteum. So the luteal phase accounts for the next half of all these days. So the luteal phase correlates with the secretory phase of the uterus because the corpus luteum is actually promoting the growth of the endometrium of the uterus. And so you can see how these ovarian and uterine cycles coincide, and they occur during specific days here. Now, it's not all symmetrical. It's not like you can divide these into thirds, right? So what we find then is that the menstrual phase is just the first 5 days, right? Proliferative phase is the next 6 or 7 days. And then their secretory phase is the next 14 days, right? So when does the menstrual phase begin? Like, what's the stimulus for menses?
Oh, decrease in hormones.
If the egg does get fertilized, corpus luteum degrades into corpus albicans, and then what happens to hormone levels? They drop out, right? And when those hormone levels fall, that's the stimulus for menstruation, right, or the menstrual phase. Now, what's interesting too, guys, is once those hormone levels are low, you start to get other hormones being released by the hypothalamus and pituitary that stimulate the growth of new follicles. So then menstrual phase and follicular phase coincide here in the beginning, okay? Now, while the follicle is growing, remember the follicular cells themselves release a little bit of estrogen. And that estrogen promotes the regrowth of that stratum functionalis, or functional layer, during the proliferative phase, right? So that as the primary follicles start to develop into secondary and tertiary, estrogen levels are rising, okay? And then at day 14, you get ovulation. So at ovulation, the follicular cells stop secreting as much estrogen, and they start turning into cells called corpus luteum, which then secretes a lot of progesterone instead. And that progesterone starts to initiate growth of this endometrium even thicker, which begins the secretory phase. And that occurs while corpus luteum is secreting that, which is why we call it the luteal phase. So these coincide. Now, there's some different hormones that influence the uterine and ovarian cycles. So back in the endocrine system, we talked about how our hypothalamus can release gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. And that gonadotropin-releasing hormone stimulated the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. So FSH was follicle-stimulating hormone. LH was luteinizing hormone. And those hormones can actually stimulate certain activities in the ovaries or the female gonads. Now, it turns out that males have the same hormones here. So that GnRH, FSH, and LH, it's all the same in males too. But what differs are the hormones that come from the gonads. So that in females, the female gonads or ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. In males, the male gonads or testes produce testosterone. There's different forms of these things too. So we see that estrogen, progesterone come from the ovary. We also have another hormone called inhibin, which actually kind of inhibits too much hormone from being released. But that GnRH comes from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary. What did LH, what does that stand for, LH? Yeah, now it makes sense, right? Luteinizing hormone is the hormone that stimulates the formation of corpus luteum, hence the name, luteinizing hormone. And what do you guys think follicle-stimulating hormone does, or FSH? Stimulates follicle development. Oh, hey, that makes sense now. So FSH then stimulates the development of primordial follicles into primary, secondary, tertiary follicles. And then luteinizing hormone is what initiates ovulation and initiates the development of the follicular cells that are left behind into corpus luteum, hence the name luteinizing hormone. Makes sense. And then the ovary can release a lot of estrogen and progesterone and inhibin. So what this slide here shows you guys is basically a summary of the hormonal processes in this form of these cyclical changes that occur during the ovarian and uterine cycles. Now, our textbook gives a paragraph explanation for this process, but I found a nice picture to summarize this as well. So what you want to do is, when you first look at this, it looks like there's a lot going on. It's actually not that bad if you just break it down step by step. So let's first look at what we're checking out here. So we have our hypothalamus and our pituitary nearby, right? So we have our hypothalamus, and it communicates with our pituitary glands, right? So what hormone does the hypothalamus release? Nice, gonadotropin and releasing hormone. Makes sense. And the anterior pituitary, as a result from GnRH stimulation, releases FSH and LH. Good. So follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the development of the follicle. So right here we see a primordial follicle, and it can start to develop into primary, secondary, tertiary follicles. And that's stimulated by FSH. Now, luteinizing hormone stimulates cells that are nearby, called thecal cells, to create something called androgen. Androgen is the precursor to sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone. But in this case, the androgens are converted to estrogen. Okay? Now, estrogen then starts to rise as the follicle grows larger, right? So follicle-stimulating hormone is causing the follicle to turn from primordial to primary follicles. And as these follicular cells get thicker, you get more estrogen being released. And it turns out that estrogen has a positive feedback effect on follicle growth. So as estrogen levels start to rise, estrogen itself stimulates the follicle to grow larger, which then you also get more estrogen being released from a larger follicle. That's what we're seeing here, you guys. So we see then is that this primordial follicle is developing into a mature follicle from the stimulation of estrogen here, right? So estrogen itself, released from the follicle, stimulates further follicle growth. Now, what's weird here is that at low concentrations, estrogen actually inhibits the hypothalamus and pituitary from releasing GnRH, FSH, and LH. Why does that make sense? Why would you want, once you start to get a follicle to develop, why would you want the estrogen from that follicle to inhibit the development of more follicles? Yeah, you don't want to litter. You got it. You don't want 30 ovulations at once. You don't want that. Our bodies, can't sustain that sort of condition. So what we find then is that our hypothalamus releases GnRH. That stimulates the release of FSH and LH. This stimulates the growth of the follicle, and estrogen at low concentration inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing GnRH, which means you don't get additional stimulation of new follicles to develop. So that means that once some primordial follicles are allowed to develop into primary follicles, they kind of close the door behind them, right? Because they start releasing hormones that inhibit further maturation of follicles. Again, that way you only have several follicles developing at any moment in time. Now, that's true for estrogen at low concentration. However, once the follicle starts to grow larger, in fact, what's causing the follicle to become larger? Estrogen. And where's the estrogen coming from? The follicle, right? So it's like self-stimulating, right? So the follicle is releasing estrogen. it's causing itself to grow larger, which means you get more estrogen. So you should see that estrogen levels rise during the follicular phase of the the ovarian cycle. Okay. Now, when estrogen levels peak at their high concentration, estrogen is no longer inhibitory on the hypothalamus. At high concentration, estrogen is actually excitatory, which is what we can see here, you guys. So that at high concentration, once you get enough estrogen from like a tertiary or a mature follicle, it actually excites the hypothalamus to release GnRH. And that GnRH causes a big old surge in luteinizing hormone. What did luteinizing hormone do? You got it. It stimulates ovulation. Good. And it makes sense, right? If the follicle is now large enough to create enough estrogen to stimulate the hypothalamus to release GnRH to stimulate the release of LH, that means that it's almost like the ovary is actually communicating with the brain to say, okay, hey, I'm ready to ovulate, right? And it does this through estrogen. Once the follicle is large enough and estrogen levels are high, they actually excite the hypothalamus, not inhibit it, they excite it, to cause an LH surge from the pituitary. This LH surge is a big old spike in luteinizing hormone right at day 14, mid-cycle, right? And that LH surge is the stimulus for ovulation. And hence the name luteinizing hormone, right? So that LH surge stimulates the ovulation here of our secondary oocyte out into the pelvic cavity. What picks up that oocyte? The fimbriae. You got it. And the fimbriae kind of waft it into the fallopian tube towards the body of the uterus. So what we find then is that for the follicular cells that get left behind, what do they turn into? Corpus luteum. Look at that. Here we go. So now we got corpus luteum here. And then our corpus luteum secretes a tremendous amount of progesterone, estrogen, and something else called inhibin. Now, on the brain, progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin all inhibit the hypothalamus and pituitary from releasing their sex hormones. Why would that make sense? Why would you want to prevent GnRH, FSH, and LH released right after ovulation? Yeah, you need time for that potentially fertilized egg to be fertilized and implant. But what if GnRH weren't inhibited at this point? You get ovulation. The secondary oocyte is now picked up by the fimbriae of your fallopian tube, right? What if GnRH and FSH and LH levels were now increasing? You get more follicles developing, right? Which means you get other hormones being released, and then it would actually kind of take the whole system out of whack, right? So we find here is that corpus luteum actually inhibits the brain from releasing further GnRH, FSH, and LH. So that way you can actually prevent any more follicles from developing at this point. So that what happens over the next 14 days then, you guys? After ovulation, that secondary oocyte gets expelled out of the ovary. It's picked up by the fallopian tube. Yeah, it could potentially be fertilized at this point, right? Now, it takes several days for the secondary oocyte to be transported towards the uterus anyways, which is typically why fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes. And then what if fertilization doesn't occur? What happens to corpus luteum? You got it. Corpus luteum degrades into corpus albicans. And then when you get corpus albicans, what happens to progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin? Those hormone levels fall. And so if you now remove progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin from your bloodstream, because the corpus luteum is not there anymore to secrete it, and the hormone levels get low, are you still inhibiting the hypothalamus? No. No, now you've removed that inhibition from the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus starts making more GnRH, and then GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, and the whole process starts over again.